On a quiet March night in 2020, the fluorescent lights hummed with a low mechanical rhythm inside a private hospital room in Moscow. The city outside was still, wrapped in the late winter darkness that always seemed to linger too long. In that sterile room, an elderly woman lay quietly, her breathing shallow but steady. This was Valentina Gagarina, the widow of the most celebrated man in Soviet history, the first human being to look down upon the Earth from the silent void of space. For more than half a century, her name had been synonymous with quiet grief and absolute loyalty to the state. Now, at 84 years of age, the time for maintaining that rigid composure was finally drawing to an end. She opened her eyes slowly, the weight of a lifetime of closely guarded memories reflecting in the dim light. Beside her bed sat her daughter, waiting in the heavy silence that had defined their family for decades. It is said that in those final hours, Valentina leaned close and whispered a few parting words. The exact nature of that late-night confession remains confined to the walls of that room, but those who knew the family suggest it was a sudden unburdening. After 52 years of absolute public silence, she was finally speaking of the invisible weight she had carried since 1968. The conversation was brief, emotionally restrained, and reportedly left more questions than it provided answers. To understand the magnitude of her silence, one must understand the strict expectations of the era. In the Soviet system, the widows of fallen heroes were not permitted to simply fade into obscurity. They were expected to become living monuments, traveling across the vast expanse of the country, attending official memorials, and publishing carefully edited memoirs that reinforced the ideological strength of the empire. Yet, from the moment her husband's death was officially announced, Valentina refused to play this role. She retreated entirely from the public eye, barricading herself in her apartment in Star City. The state archives hold no expansive interviews with her, no tearful television broadcasts, and no public lamentations. This total withdrawal was initially accepted by the authorities as the natural reaction of a deeply traumatized woman. A quiet widow was, in many ways, easier to manage than an unpredictable one. But as the decades passed and the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, researchers began to quietly examine the gray archives of the space program. They sifted through the dusty classified folders of the late 1960s, looking for the routine paperwork that followed any major aviation disaster. Instead of clarity, they found a strange chain of contradictions. Official documents were altered. Certain testimonies did not align with the established timeline. And at the very center of this bureaucratic fog was the enigmatic figure of Valentina herself. Those who study the deeper hidden mechanisms of the Cold War often point out that true secrets are rarely hidden in locked vaults. More often, they are concealed in plain sight, hidden within the strange behavior of ordinary people living under extraordinary pressure. There are memories suggesting that Valentina's reclusive life was not merely an act of mourning, but an act of strict compliance. According to one version whispered among former aerospace engineers, her total isolation was a mandatory condition for keeping a truth that the state could not afford to acknowledge. She lived surrounded by military guards, wiretapped telephones, and the constant unspoken surveillance that characterized life in a closed scientific city. When Valentina finally passed away in that quiet Moscow hospital room, the news was reported briefly by the national press, marking the end of an era. The woman who had stood beside the ultimate symbol of Soviet triumph was gone, taking with her whatever definitive clarification she possessed. Her death closed the final living chapter of a narrative that began on a fateful morning in 1968. Yet rather than settling the past, her departure only amplified the lingering unease among historians. By choosing to remain silent for 52 years, only to offer a few quiet words at the very edge of life, she ensured that the official story would always be haunted by the shadow of an extraordinary and unresolved mystery. For more than half a century, the official narrative of Yuri Gagarin's fate remained simple, tragic, and entirely untouchable. On the morning of March 27, 1968, the nation was suddenly told that their brightest hero had perished. The announcement echoed through crackling radio broadcasts and across the sprawling concrete squares of Soviet cities, bringing an entire empire to a standstill. The story presented to the public was one of sudden, unavoidable misfortune. Gagarin, an experienced pilot who had conquered the absolute zero of space, supposedly met his end during a routine training flight when his fighter jet plummeted into the dense frozen woods of the Vladimir region. The details provided by the State Commission painted a bleak picture of that gray March morning. According to the official report, Gagarin and his flight instructor took off in a MiG-15 aircraft, ascending into heavily overcast skies. Minutes later, communication simply ceased. Search parties dispatched to the snowy forests eventually located a smoldering crater surrounded by shattered birch trees and twisted metal. It was a violent, chaotic scene, one that military investigators quickly cordoned off from unauthorized eyes. The state rapidly concluded that an unexpected meteorological balloon or a sharp evasive maneuver had sent the aircraft into an unrecoverable tailspin, smashing it violently into the damp earth. The Soviet Union stopped everything to mourn the unimaginable loss of its most universally beloved figure. Factories fell silent, schools dismissed their students, and flags across the vast territory were lowered. Grand state funerals were swiftly organized in Moscow, an orchestrated display of collective grief heavily monitored by the authorities. Millions of citizens watched as military officers carried urns through the solemn, sweeping expanse of Red Square. With somber precision, the containers holding what were said to be the cremated remains of the two pilots were permanently sealed within the dark red bricks of the Kremlin wall, taking their rightful place alongside the most revered and historic figures of the nation. To the ordinary citizen, this grand ceremony provided profound finality to a national tragedy. The book on the first cosmonaut was decisively closed by the state, bound in thick black leather and locked away in the collective memory of the people. However, behind the heavy oak doors of government ministries, the atmosphere was far less settled. The massive investigative commission, comprising hundreds of aviation experts and military officials, compiled dozens of volumes regarding the crash. Yet, almost as soon as the ink dried on the final conclusions, those extensive reports were abruptly classified. Access was restricted even to high-ranking military personnel, plunging the actual mechanics of the incident into complete darkness. People who worked at the site later recalled a highly controlled recovery operation where nothing seemed to follow standard aviation protocols. There are memories suggesting that the physical evidence retrieved from the snowy crater was oddly sparse for a high-speed impact of that specific magnitude. Rumors began to circulate among the elite test pilots at Chkalovsky Airfield that the recovered fragments of the flight suits and equipment did not entirely match what the men were documented to be wearing. Some testimonies indicate that the forensic identification process was rushed, conducted with an unnatural urgency that left seasoned medical examiners feeling deeply uncomfortable with the paperwork they were ordered to immediately sign. It was this exact environment of forced closure and bureaucratic secrecy that Valentina was left to navigate alone. As the state cemented the legend of the fallen martyr in stone and bronze, the widow was left holding the unvarnished, fragmented reality of that bleak March afternoon. The official narrative demanded that she accept the ashes in the wall as the undeniable end of her husband's extraordinary journey. Yet, according to one version, the contradictions she privately witnessed in those early days laid the foundation for her enduring silence. She knew the neat, tragic story broadcasted over the state radios was missing vital pieces, and her lifelong refusal to speak was not merely grief, but a quiet, sustained act of defiance. In the immediate aftermath of the state funeral, Valentina Gagarina returned to the heavily guarded confines of Star City, a closed military settlement hidden deep within the forests outside Moscow. Here, among the identical concrete apartment blocks and the quiet hum of classified aerospace facilities, she became known simply as the Silent Widow. The world outside demanded a grieving icon, a woman who would stand before microphones and weep for the cameras in a sanctioned display of patriotic sorrow. But she offered the public nothing. While the nation collectively mourned the loss of its pioneering cosmonaut, the woman who knew him best retreated entirely into the deep shadows of her meticulously monitored Soviet apartment, locking the door to the outside world. This absolute withdrawal stood in stark contrast to the established traditions of the era. Unlike the spouses of other fallen state heroes who routinely toured the vast country to deliver carefully scripted speeches at factories and pioneer camps, Valentina refused to participate in the machinery of remembrance. She didn't write extensive memoirs to honor the dead, nor did she allow state biographers to mold her grief into an ideological weapon. Other widows were expected to become living monuments, their personal tragedies absorbed into the larger narrative of Soviet sacrifice and triumph. Yet she actively rejected this path, choosing instead a profound isolation that many within the party apparatus found unnerving, even highly suspicious. Her daily existence was defined by the sensory realities of a classified military zone. The long stretches of winter darkness seemed to swallow the gray architecture of the closed city, where the only sounds were the distant mechanical drone of testing centrifuges and the crunch of boots on frozen snow. Inside her modest apartment, the telephone rarely rang with casual calls. Communication in Star City was always filtered through switchboards and unseen listeners. According to one version whispered among former aerospace engineers, her strict seclusion was not merely a personal choice, but a heavily enforced condition. People who lived in the same building later recalled that her windows often remained heavily curtained, keeping watchful eyes at a distance. Over the following decades, she maintained an unbroken wall of silence against the relentless inquiries of journalists and historians. She refused almost all interview requests, turning away both domestic reporters and international correspondents who arrived with lucrative offers for her story. She declined to authorize publications or collaborate on documentaries, preserving a boundary that no investigator could cross. Some testimonies indicate that high-ranking officials periodically visited her residence, checking to ensure that this silence remained absolute. A classified report supposedly mentioned her as a unique case, a civilian who understood the necessity of keeping state secrets without ever being formally employed by the state security apparatus. Most curiously, she actively avoided any detailed discussion regarding the final years of her husband's life. If pressed by close acquaintances, she would change the subject, leaving the period between his historic flight and his sudden disappearance completely blank. There were no nostalgic reflections on his final months, no anecdotes about his state of mind before the fatal training mission. This omission seemed deeply unnatural to those who studied the psychology of mourning. Why would a grieving wife erase the most immediate memories of her husband? The quiet corridors of the archives offer no explanation for this deliberate void. Perhaps it was simply the heavy burden of trauma, or perhaps the final years were not what the official record claimed. The heavy iron doors of the state repositories rarely yield their secrets without a quiet struggle. For nearly 30 years, the official 29 volumes detailing the events of March 27, 1968, remained sealed away in the gray archives of the Soviet military apparatus. It was only when the empire eventually fractured that civilian researchers were finally permitted to walk down those dimly lit corridors. They arrived expecting to find the definitive, exhaustive record of a tragic but straightforward aviation disaster. Instead, they encountered an unsettling quietness in the paperwork. The first quiet doubts began to emerge as they turned the brittle pages and realized that the meticulous Soviet bureaucracy had somehow failed to keep its own history intact. Investigators who spent their lives navigating the complex filing systems of the Ministry of Defense immediately noticed strange gaps in the historical record. In a state that obsessively documented every minor mechanical failure and disciplinary infraction, the most significant aviation accident of the decade lacked critical components. Documents directly connected to the immediate aftermath of the crash investigation were mysteriously absent from the central state folders. Entire sections detailing the initial site surveys, the radar tracking logs from the nearby Chkalovsky airfield, and the primary testimonies of the recovery crews had simply vanished. There was no record of their transfer, no authorization for their destruction, only the hollow space where the truth should have been. To the casual observer, the archive might have looked complete, a towering monument of typed pages and official stamps. But a deeper examination of the master catalog revealed a deliberate surgical removal of evidence. The official index clearly listed the exact registration numbers and titles of the missing files, proving that they had once existed within those heavily guarded concrete walls. According to one version suggested by former archivists, these specific folders were not lost to time. A classified report supposedly mentioned a direct order from the highest levels of state security to quietly extract these materials. The timeline of this removal was equally disturbing. The documents did not disappear during a period of political chaos, but merely a few short years after the accident. Of all the missing documents, the most deeply unsettling absence involved the medical materials explicitly used for the identification of the remains. In any standard aviation disaster, forensic pathology reports form the absolute foundation of the official conclusion. The archival index clearly noted the presence of detailed autopsy records, dental comparisons, and biological analyses conducted in the immediate hours following the crash. Yet when researchers requested these specific physical files, they were handed empty cardboard sleeves. The very proof that Yuri Gagarin had died in that frozen crater was gone. Why would the state conceal the medical evidence of a fatal accident? The absence of these documents cast a long, cold shadow over the urn resting inside the Kremlin wall. People who worked at the secure medical facilities during that era later recalled a profound atmosphere of tension surrounding the examining physicians. Some testimonies indicate that the specialists brought in to sign the death certificates were closely monitored by armed men in plain clothes. They were not allowed to retain their own notes. There are memories suggesting that the tissue samples and flight suit fragments presented for analysis were heavily restricted, handled with an extraordinary level of compartmentalization. If the state merely wanted to document the tragic death of a pilot, this intense level of secrecy was entirely disproportionate. It resembled the protocol of a covert intelligence operation rather than a standard forensic inquiry into a tragic training accident. These gaping holes in the Soviet archives eventually provided a new lens through which to view the silent widow of Star City. If the official investigation was stripped of its most critical evidence, what exactly had Valentina been told during those dark days in 1968? The missing files suggest a narrative that was carefully constructed and heavily sanitized before it was ever presented to the public. She lived her life in the shadow of an archive that had been deliberately hollowed out. The erased radar logs and the vanished medical reports point toward a reality far more complex than a simple loss of control in the winter sky. They stand as silent witnesses to an event the state was desperate to manage, hinting at a truth that still refuses to quietly fade into the past. The heavy machinery of the Soviet state rarely moved with hesitation, especially when delivering catastrophic news to its most prominent citizens. On the gray afternoon of March 27, 1968, a small convoy of black vehicles quietly navigated the secured checkpoints of Star City. Inside her modest, heavily monitored apartment, Valentina Gagarina waited. The men who ascended the concrete stairwell to her door were not merely military liaisons. They were high-ranking officials and state security personnel tasked with managing the immediate fallout of an impossible tragedy. Adding to the unease of the historical record were the later testimonies regarding Valentina's initial reaction when they finally delivered the devastating report of the crash. A security officer present in the confined space of her living room that day later recalled a deeply unsettling detail about her demeanor. In the presence of generals and intelligence operatives, the widow of the empire's greatest hero was officially informed that her husband's fighter jet had plunged into the frozen earth. According to his account, recorded decades after the dissolution of the state, her response defied all psychological expectations. She wept as any spouse would upon hearing such a sudden and violent declaration. But the officer noted that she did not weep with the absolute shattering despair of a woman who had just been told she had lost her husband forever. there was an eerie, calculated restraint in her sorrow that immediately caught his trained eye. Instead of collapsing into the paralyzing grief that typically follows a fatal aviation disaster, her behavior suggested a profoundly different internal reality. The officer described her physical posture and the nature of her tears as those of a person enduring an agonizing weight rather than mourning a final, irreversible loss. She repeatedly asked highly specific technical questions about the recovery teams and the exact condition of the flight suits, rather than focusing on the absolute tragedy of his death. Some testimonies indicate that she spent those first few hours staring intensely at the encrypted telephone in the hallway, as if anticipating a secondary call. It was the distinct demeanor of a woman waiting for a quiet confirmation that ultimately never came. To the hardened men standing in her apartment, this reaction was entirely incongruous with the raw, chaotic grief they had witnessed in the homes of other fallen test pilots. In the closed world of Soviet aviation, death was a familiar, brutal intruder, and its arrival always brought an undeniable, crushing finality. Yet Valentina seemed anchored by an invisible thread of doubt or hidden knowledge. There are memories suggesting that the security personnel exchanged quiet, uneasy glances as the afternoon faded into the long winter darkness. They had arrived prepared to sedate a hysterical widow, only to find a woman carefully analyzing the fragmented information they provided. Why would she search for loopholes in a narrative delivered by the highest authorities of the state? As the days progressed toward the grand state funeral, this strange emotional distance only solidified. When the time came to view the remains, the state presented only sealed urns, citing the violent, high-speed nature of the impact in the remote Vladimir region. Valentina was never permitted to see a body, nor did she violently demand to do so. People who worked at the site later recalled that the physical evidence was removed with unnatural speed, leaving the family with nothing but official paperwork. A classified report supposedly mentioned that her acceptance of the closed casket protocol was remarkably immediate, lacking the desperate denial usually exhibited by grieving families. She accepted the ashes without demanding the visceral proof that human nature normally requires. This unnatural composure forms one of the most persistent mysteries of the entire Gagarin narrative. Was she simply in a state of profound psychological shock, paralyzed by the overwhelming machinery of the Soviet state surrounding her? Or did her lack of final despair stem from something whispered in the dark before he left, a contingency plan that required absolute silence and infinite patience? According to one version, her tears were not for a man who had burned in a forest crater, but for a husband who had just vanished into the subterranean architecture of a classified program. As she sat in her apartment, listening to the static hum of radio noise from the nearby military installations, she began a half-century vigil that the state never fully understood. The strange psychological composure of the silent widow might have been easily dismissed as profound shock, but the anomalies extended far beyond her initial grief. They bled directly into the rigid, unforgiving bureaucracy of the Soviet military-industrial complex. In a system where every movement was documented, tracked, and strictly controlled by the state security apparatus, access to classified zones was governed by absolute necessity. A civilian without active scientific or military duties simply did not possess the physical means to pass through the heavily guarded checkpoints of the empire. Yet the paper trail left behind in the gray archives tells a very different, highly irregular story about Valentina. Decades after the collapse of the state, researchers examining declassified logistical records made a startling discovery. Archival logs revealed that for more than 20 years following the crash, Valentina retained active, high-level access passes to some of the most heavily restricted aerospace facilities in the country. These were not ceremonial documents or honorary titles granted to a grieving spouse. They were functional, highly classified clearance badges, renewed annually by the highest echelons of the Soviet military command. According to one version, the continuous authorization of these specific passes required the direct signature of officials who oversaw the most secretive defense projects of the Cold War era. The facilities she was permitted to enter were not public museums or administrative offices, but the absolute nerve centers of the Soviet space apparatus. Some testimonies indicate that she regularly walked through the subterranean architecture of design bureaus and isolated research laboratories. These were stark, concrete environments defined by the scent of ozone, the constant hum of encrypted radio noise, and the distant vibrations of deep-level testing. To reach these underground corridors, one had to navigate multiple layers of armed security, blast doors, and identity verifications. It was a realm built for engineers and intelligence officers, not for the civilian widow of a pilot who had officially died in 1968. Her physical presence in these restricted zones created a lingering sense of unease among the personnel. People who worked at the sites later recalled seeing her moving quietly through the heavily monitored halls, always escorted by high-ranking military liaisons. She never spoke to the technicians or engineers, nor did she observe the testing of new flight hardware. She merely passed through, a silent, solitary figure navigating the labyrinthine complexes hidden beneath the winter darkness. This continuous access was a privilege never granted to any other grieving widow of the era.
Other families of fallen test pilots were systematically locked out of the closed cities the moment their husbands were lowered into the frozen ground. This extraordinary level of access inevitably raises a profound and disturbing question regarding her true role. Why would the Soviet state apparatus, known for its extreme paranoia and obsession with compartmentalization, allow a grieving civilian to wander through its most sensitive installations for 2 decades? A classified report supposedly mentioned that her visits were tied to an ongoing psychological support protocol, though the specifics of that protocol remain entirely redacted. There are memories suggesting that she spent hours inside heavily soundproofed administrative wings, sitting in waiting rooms that connected directly to secure, closed-circuit communication hubs linking the various black sites of the empire. The idea that a simple widow commanded such enduring logistical power suggests a narrative completely detached from the official history of a tragic aviation accident. Every year, someone deep within the state security apparatus actively ensured that her clearances were renewed, maintaining her invisible tether to the classified world. According to some later witnesses, her demeanor during these visits was never that of a mourning wife visiting a memorial, but rather a woman quietly fulfilling a long-term obligation. Her phantom presence in those secret research centers stands as silent bureaucratic proof that whatever truly happened on that bleak March afternoon, the Soviet state required her continuous physical cooperation. As the decades passed and the immense structure of the Soviet state finally collapsed under its own weight,
the physical monuments of its aerospace triumphs began to slowly decay. Entire military installations and closed cities were abandoned to the biting winter darkness, their concrete walls cracking as heating systems failed. Among these forgotten sites was a heavily secured, nameless administrative building located on the deep periphery of the sprawling military-industrial complex. For years, it stood completely silent, its underground corridors filled with nothing but freezing water and echoes. It was during the late 1990s, when private demolition crews finally arrived to dismantle the rusting infrastructure, that a startling discovery was reportedly made in the ruins. The workers were instructed to tear down the interior partitions of an office suite that had once belonged to high-ranking intelligence officers attached to the aerospace division. According to one version whispered among historians, as heavy hammers shattered a thick, load-bearing concrete wall, they inadvertently cracked open a small, deliberately constructed hidden cavity. Inside this dark, airless space lay a tightly bound cache of old personal notes wrapped in thick oilcloth to protect them from the relentless dampness. The fragile papers smelled intensely of the gray archives and cold dust, preserving a secret that had been sealed away for over a quarter of a century. The foreman immediately halted the demolition, recognizing that they had unearthed something deeply unusual. The confiscated bundle eventually found its way into the hands of independent researchers who specialized in the undocumented history of the Cold War. As they carefully flattened the brittle yellowed pages, they realized these were not official blueprints or discarded logistical manifests. They were deeply personal, handwritten letters, devoid of any formal state stamps or bureaucratic signatures. Researchers noted with growing unease that the distinct measured handwriting appeared to perfectly match Valentina Gagarina's known script. Some testimonies indicate that linguistic experts were quietly brought in to verify the stroke patterns and ink composition, concluding that the documents were almost certainly penned by the silent widow of Star City during the late 1970s. The contents of these concealed pages completely shattered the established historical narrative of a grieving woman mourning a dead pilot. Instead of detailing the agonizing finality of widowhood, the texts vividly detailed the incredibly heavy toll of a continuous, grueling separation. The letters spoke repeatedly of an infinite patience required to endure a life lived entirely in the shadows. There are memories suggesting that the author wrote extensively about the surreal psychological burden of loving a man she could no longer be seen with in the light of day. She described the profound isolation of waiting for brief, heavily monitored encounters that were orchestrated by unseen handlers in the absolute dead of night, far away from the prying eyes of the ordinary civilian world. A classified report supposedly mentioned that the author frequently referenced the distant hum of drilling sites and the encrypted radio noise that characterized the most remote outposts of the empire. She wrote of a man who was alive but fundamentally erased from the surface of the earth, bound by an oath that superseded even the sanctity of their marriage. These were not the poetic metaphors of a woman losing her grip on reality. They were highly specific, grounded observations of a heavily regimented existence. The tone was always calm, confident, and utterly serious, devoid of any melodrama or desperate fantasy. It was the careful, restrained voice of a partner who fully understood the terrifying, unseen mechanisms of the state security apparatus that governed their daily lives.
Why would such deeply intimate confessions be hidden inside the reinforced walls of a military intelligence building rather than kept in a private home? According to some later witnesses, hiding the letters in a state facility might have been the only way to bypass the relentless surveillance of her own apartment. She knew her personal quarters in Star City were periodically searched by operatives looking for any breach in her absolute silence. By leaving the letters in a dead drop within a secure zone, she ensured they would survive the purges of the era. These fragile, oilcloth-wrapped pages remain one of the most chilling contradictions of the entire Gagarin legacy, suggesting that the ashes sealed in the Kremlin wall were nothing more than an elaborate state-sponsored illusion. The concealed letters found in the ruined administrative building were not the only fragments of the past that defied the established history of 1968. Even more perplexing were the private, heavily guarded notebooks Valentina maintained in the absolute solitude of her Star City apartment. While the Soviet state demanded that she perform the role of the eternally grieving widow, behind the closed curtained windows of her residence, she quietly engaged in a deeply unorthodox ritual of record-keeping. For decades, she filled countless pages of ordinary civilian ledgers with her meticulous, measured handwriting, documenting a life that the official archives insisted had violently ended in the freezing mud of the Vladimir region. When researchers eventually gained access to a small fraction of these intimate diaries long after her death, they immediately noticed a jarring, fundamental anomaly. In every single entry spanning more than 50 years, when writing about her husband, she systematically defied the universal linguistic rules of mourning. A widow naturally consigns her lost spouse to the past, relying heavily on memories of what was once said and done. Yet Valentina deliberately and exclusively utilized verbs strictly in the present tense. She did not write that he loved the quiet of the morning, or that he said the winter darkness felt heavy. Instead, her pages were entirely filled with phrases like, "he loves," and "he says," completely ignoring the crash. To traditional historians and psychologists, this refusal to use the past tense could easily be interpreted as a manifestation of profound, unresolved trauma. According to one version, the sudden violence of the alleged aviation disaster fractured her ability to process time, leaving her trapped in a permanent state of psychological denial. But those who intimately understood the paranoid, highly structured reality of the Soviet military apparatus argued that such a simple explanation ignored the surrounding context of her life. Her diaries were not chaotic, frantic scrawls of a deteriorating mind. They were organized, lucid, and remarkably calm, suggesting a literal reality where her husband was still a very active presence in the world. Some testimonies indicate that the entries often referenced highly specific, mundane details that seemed to correspond to ongoing, contemporary events rather than frozen memories from the 1960s. She would write about his current opinions on the shifting political climate or his physical reactions to the changing seasons, as if she were receiving regular, updated observations from a distant source. There are memories suggesting that she occasionally noted his specific requests for certain domestic items or books, detailing an ongoing dialogue that completely contradicted the silence of the urn sealed within the Kremlin wall. It was the precise, unembellished documentation of a marriage that was simply operating across a vast, unseen distance. What makes the existence of these present-tense notebooks even more unsettling is the absolute certainty that the state security apparatus knew about them. In a heavily monitored environment like Star City, where every wall concealed listening devices and mail was routinely intercepted, keeping a continuous subversive diary was an incredibly dangerous act. A classified report supposedly mentioned that operatives conducted covert searches of her apartment during her rare absences. They undoubtedly read the ledgers, photographing the pages filled with present-tense verbs. Yet they never confiscated the books, never reprimanded her, and never forced her into a psychiatric facility, which was the standard Soviet procedure for handling public delusions. This unnatural tolerance by the secret police implies a terrifying bureaucratic complicity. If the state allowed her to maintain this written reality without interference, it strongly suggests that her words were not considered delusional, but merely a heavily compartmentalized truth. People who worked within the intelligence sectors later recalled that certain classified operatives were strictly forbidden from correcting her. She was permitted to write that he lives because, according to some whispers in the dark corridors of the archives, the state knew exactly where he was breathing. The quiet scratch of her pen across those ledger pages remains a haunting testament to a woman who refused to bury a man who was still walking the earth. The machinery of the Soviet Empire was vast, but its darkest gears turned completely out of sight. Decades after the red flag was lowered for the final time, a former official who once operated within the deepest, most insulated layers of Soviet state security broke his silence. Sitting in the fading light of a Moscow winter, he spoke quietly of the hidden architecture of the Cold War. His memories did not concern standard espionage or political purges, but rather the extreme measures the state utilized to protect its irreplaceable assets. According to his careful testimony, the archives of the era contain shadows that even the highest-ranking generals were entirely forbidden to acknowledge. The architecture of secrecy relied on protocols so sensitive they were never fully committed to standard paperwork. At the center of his revelation was the existence of a highly classified, almost mythical Cold War protocol. A classified report supposedly mentioned a rare, meticulously designed procedure where the state occasionally orchestrated the official violent deaths of its own citizens. This was not an act of elimination, but an act of extreme preservation. When a specific individual became too critical to the ongoing survival or technological dominance of the empire, leaving them exposed to the random chaos of ordinary life was considered an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. A fatal accident would be carefully synthesized, complete with forged medical logs, sealed urns, and heavily monitored state funerals designed to permanently close the book on their public existence. Once the nation was suitably convinced of the tragic loss, the subject was seamlessly transferred into deep-cover black projects. There are memories suggesting that these individuals were quietly relocated to nameless closed cities far beyond the Ural Mountains, where the winter darkness stretched for months and the perimeter fences were heavily electrified. Stripped of their previous identities, they were essentially reborn as ghosts of the state apparatus. In these subterranean research facilities, surrounded by the constant hum of encrypted radio noise and distant drilling sites, they continued their vital work in absolute isolation. Their existence was entirely erased from the surface of the world, hidden beneath layers of undeniable bureaucratic finality. Such extraordinary operations were reportedly reserved only for those whose minds, unique physiological experiences, or immense public images were deemed simply too valuable to risk.
An intelligence asset could be replaced, and a brilliant engineer could be duplicated. But certain living symbols possessed a gravity that the state could not afford to lose in a senseless, uncontrolled accident. If a global icon were to defect, speak out against the regime, or perish in a way that embarrassed the empire, the ideological damage would be catastrophic. By preemptively claiming their lives through a controlled tragedy, the state secured their absolute obedience and permanently locked away their irreplaceable knowledge behind concrete walls and armed checkpoints. This chilling bureaucratic reality forces a profound reevaluation of the events surrounding the 27th of March, 1968. Was the most famous pilot in human history subjected to this ultimate protocol? Yuri Gagarin was the absolute embodiment of Soviet triumph, a man whose smile conquered the globe, yet he was also an individual who had grown increasingly exhausted by his role as a heavily managed state idol. Some testimonies indicate he had begun asking difficult questions, seeking to return to active spaceflight despite the direct prohibitions of his superiors. He was a living monument, but living monuments are notoriously difficult to control once they begin to move independently against the rigid expectations of the ruling apparatus. If the highest levels of the military-industrial complex determined that their brightest star was becoming a severe liability, or, conversely, that his unique physiological understanding of spaceflight was urgently required for a highly classified orbital program, the protocol would have been the perfect solution. A sudden crash in the remote Vladimir region provided the necessary cover. It was violent enough to justify a closed casket and sudden enough to prevent any immediate civilian inquiry. For the state, it solved an impossible logistical problem. For Valentina, it meant the beginning of a 52-year sentence bound by silence to a man who was officially dead, yet still breathing somewhere in the vast freezing expanse of the hidden Soviet Empire. If such a highly classified shadow procedure was actually invoked on that gray morning in 1968, the logistical execution would have been absolute. It would mean immediately relocating the subject far away from the prying eyes of Moscow and the standard military hierarchy. The Soviet map was dotted with vast blank spaces, territories that didn't exist on any public atlas. These were the empire's nameless closed cities, built entirely for the purpose of absolute state secrecy. To disappear into one of these zones was to be erased from the surface of the earth. The state possessed the vast infrastructure necessary to make a man vanish completely while ensuring he could continue to serve the strategic interests of the nation without interruption. Life within these restricted perimeters was defined by an imposing isolation. Behind thick concrete walls and electrified fences, the passage of time felt entirely different. The environment was characterized by months of punishing winter darkness, where the only illumination came from the stark floodlights of military installations. Distant drilling sites pounded rhythmically against the frozen ground, merging with the constant mechanical hum of encrypted radio noise that saturated the freezing air. It was a sensory deprivation chamber on a massive scale, designed to break any connection to the outside world. In such a heavily regimented atmosphere, an individual's past identity could be systematically dismantled and permanently replaced by a state-issued number. Yet the idea that the state could successfully conceal this specific individual remains a staggering proposition. This was not a nameless intelligence operative or a quiet aerospace engineer.
This was the era's most universally recognizable human face. His image had been broadcast on every television and carved into monuments across the globe. Hiding a figure of such immense magnitude would require an unprecedented level of compartmentalization. According to one version, he would have been restricted entirely to a subterranean facility, moving only through artificially lit underground corridors. His interactions would be strictly limited to a small circle of heavily vetted scientists and top-tier security personnel sworn to absolute silence. What could possibly justify such an extraordinary and resource-intensive deception? Some testimonies indicate that the Soviet space apparatus was quietly preparing for deep space initiatives that were far too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. A classified report supposedly mentioned the need for long-term psychological and physiological endurance testing, requiring a subject who had already experienced the absolute void of orbit. If the state needed a veteran cosmonaut for a highly classified, permanently grounded simulator program, the hero of 1961 was the logical candidate. He would become a living test subject, his unmatched biological data harvested in secret while the rest of the world laid flowers at a hollow grave in the center of the capital. This dark scenario provides a chilling, coherent explanation for the bizarre anomalies that defined Valentina's subsequent life. It contextualizes the strange missing files from the crash investigation and the rushed, secretive medical reports. More importantly, it explains the archival logs showing her continuous decades-long access passes to heavily restricted aerospace facilities. People who worked at those sites later recalled her silent visits to secure communication hubs. She was not wandering those underground corridors out of grief. She was maintaining a carefully orchestrated, highly monitored lifeline to a man who was buried alive by his own government. Her present-tense diaries were the exact documentation of this unimaginable subterranean reality. To accept this version of history is to accept a level of state control that borders on the absolute. It suggests a government capable of seamlessly orchestrating the public mourning of 1 billion people while quietly keeping the subject of their tears locked away in the freezing dark. While traditional historians reject this narrative as an elaborate Cold War myth, the physical evidence of Valentina's lifelong behavior refuses to align with the official tragedy. The letters hidden in the cavity of the administrative building, speaking of infinite patience and a love kept out of the light of day, echo with the undeniable truth of a prolonged captivity. It leaves us staring into the gray archives, wondering just how deep the Soviet silence truly ran. Today, historians remain sharply divided over the scattered, contradictory fragments left behind by this enduring Cold War enigma. The gray archives of the Soviet state have slowly opened their heavy iron doors over the past few decades, yet the exact events surrounding the aftermath of 1968 remain deeply obscured by shadows. When analyzing the physical evidence connected to the silent widow of Star City, modern investigators consistently find themselves standing at a complex crossroads of historical interpretation. The available documentation refuses to offer a single unified truth, forcing researchers to navigate a labyrinth of missing files and strange personal testimonies without a clear compass. One prominent version insists that the countless anomalies are simply the result of overwhelming Soviet bureaucratic incompetence. The military-industrial complex was a massive, unwieldy apparatus, highly prone to clerical errors and misplaced paperwork. Those who support this theory argue that the missing medical files and the absent radar logs were not intentionally destroyed by state security, but merely lost in the chaotic reshuffling of military records. A classified report supposedly mentioned the chronic disorganization of the Chkalovsky airfield archives during the late 1960s. In this view, a tragic but ordinary aviation accident was simply poorly documented by terrified officials who feared punishment. Following this more conventional line of reasoning, Valentina's absolute silence is viewed strictly through the lens of profound psychological trauma. Proponents of this theory argue that her behavior was the desperate coping mechanism of a traumatized woman clinging to a state of profound denial. The sudden violent loss of her husband shattered her reality, causing her to retreat entirely from the public eye. Her continuous use of present-tense verbs in her private notebooks is interpreted not as proof of a hidden life, but as a well-documented psychological response to complicated grief. She isolated herself in the winter darkness of her apartment because the outside world demanded a closure she could not give. Yet another deeply compelling interpretation argues that this standard explanation completely fails to address the logistical realities of the Soviet state. The missing investigation files were far too specific to be random clerical errors. They were the exact documents required to prove biological death. Furthermore, the argument of bureaucratic oversight cannot explain her long-term security clearances. For over 2 decades, high-ranking military commanders consistently renewed her access to heavily restricted aerospace facilities. Some testimonies indicate she regularly visited these underground complexes. Such continuous, high-level logistical privileges were never accidentally granted to a civilian by the secret police. This alternative perspective suggests that the physical evidence points toward a tightly controlled state deception in which she was a quiet, lifelong participant. The cache of personal letters discovered hidden inside the ruined administrative building does not read like the chaotic ramblings of a woman broken by grief. Instead, they detail the heavy toll of a long separation with absolute rational clarity. The handwriting speaks of infinite patience and the surreal burden of loving a man she could no longer be seen with in the light of day. There are memories suggesting that her calm demeanor was the result of a strict oath, a silent agreement made with the state security apparatus to protect a husband who still lived. These two opposing interpretations remain locked in a perpetual stalemate, offering no easy resolution to the mystery that defined her entire existence. To accept the first requires believing in an unprecedented string of coincidences and the uncharacteristic leniency of the Soviet secret police toward a subversive civilian. To accept the second requires confronting the staggering possibility that the state successfully orchestrated one of the most elaborate human concealments in modern history. As investigators continue to sift through the cold dust of the archives, the silence of the widow continues to hold its ground, leaving us suspended in a quiet, enduring tension between official history and whispered Cold War rumors. These competing interpretations offer no final comfort, leaving only a lingering sense of doubt in their wake. The archives remain a place of gray dust and heavily redacted truths where the absolute certainty of 1968 has slowly dissolved into a profound, unsettling ambiguity. We are left to wonder if Valentina Gagarina spent her life purely protecting the unblemished memory of a fallen pilot after a sudden and tragic accident, or if she was the solitary, lifelong guardian of the most profound secret of the 20th century. The Soviet state built massive monuments of bronze and stone to ensure the public never looked beyond the official narrative. Yet her quiet, unyielding existence stood as a permanent counter-narrative to the heavy certainty of the Kremlin wall. For 52 years, she inhabited a world defined by its stark sensory isolation, navigating the heavily curtained windows of Star City, the encrypted radio noise echoing through secure communication hubs, and the silent, endless winters that buried the closed cities of the empire in snow. If she was merely a grieving widow, her endurance was a testament to a shattering, paralyzing trauma that the state callously managed but never attempted to heal. But if she was a conscious participant in a shadow protocol, her silence was an act of unimaginable discipline and devotion. She carried the heavy weight of a classified reality, bound by an invisible tether to a man who officially did not exist, quietly walking a labyrinth of military security clearances and whispered rumors. The final moments of this extraordinary 52-year vigil brought no grand revelations to the public. When the fluorescent lights hummed in that private Moscow hospital room in March of 2020, she was no longer the young woman who had watched the sky on a crisp spring morning. She was the last living vault of a deeply compartmentalized era. Whatever few words she whispered to her daughter in the quiet of the night, they were not recorded for the archives, nor were they broadcast to the historians who had spent decades hunting for a single crack in her armor. She remained in absolute control of the narrative until the very end, treating the ultimate truth not as a piece of history to be openly shared, but as a private possession to be taken away into the dark. When the medical machines finally fell silent in that room, the definitive answer vanished completely with her. The missing medical files, the absent radar logs, the present tense diaries, and the hidden cache of personal letters now stand as orphaned evidence in a historical case that can never be officially closed. The immense state apparatus that orchestrated the events of 1968 no longer exists, its vast military-industrial complex reduced to rusting drilling sites and declassified, hollowed-out concrete bunkers. Yet the mystery she left behind continues to breathe, refusing to be buried under the weight of time. The absolute silence of the widow of Star City remains the loudest, most enduring echo of the Soviet space program's deeply hidden history. As we stand in the long shadow of these unanswered questions, the true nature of her sacrifice remains for each of us to carefully weigh in the quiet of our own minds. The history of the Cold War is written in the obscured margins of the official record, and understanding its depths requires looking far beyond the accepted surface. I invite you to step further into the gray archives and watch the other videos in our documentary series, where we continue to explore the hidden lives and classified anomalies of the era. Take a moment to write your opinion in the comments below, sharing your own interpretation of Valentina's enduring silence. Finally, if you value this kind of careful, atmospheric storytelling, please like the video, helping us ensure that these mysteries are never forgotten.